Masechta Peah, Perek Daled, Mishnah Aleph. This perek is going to discuss the way which the aniyim come and collect the Peah. Hapeni tenis b'mechuber l'karka. Peah is to be given while it's still attached to the ground. B'dalis u'bedekel balabayis morid u'mechalik l'aniyim. In the case of the grapevine and the date tree, the palm tree, however, the owner brings down the fruit and distributes it equally to the poor, since it would be dangerous for the poor people to compete for the Peah while climbing them. Reb Shimon says that this is also true in the case of the walnut tree, which is dangerous for the poor people to climb because it's a very smooth trunk of the tree, and the owner must therefore bring down its Peah and distribute it. The Mishnah goes back to the beginning and says that the basic halacha of Peah is for the owner to leave the standing stalks for the poor. Even if 99 of the poor people who come to the field say that they want the owner to cut it down and distribute the Peah to them equally, and only one of them says that he wants for them all to cut and grab as much as each one can, to this one we listen because he says according to the halacha. The owner must follow the wishes of the lone poor person who wishes for the poor to cut and take the Peah themselves in open competition, which is an interesting idea, but that's what the Mishnah says by Peah, that it has to be left as an open competition, because that the lone poor person is insisting on following the halachas of Peah the way it should be. This applies if that lone poor person is bigger and stronger than all the others and wishes to use his physical advantages to take more Peah than they do. The Mishnah would seem to apply that if all the poor people, without exception, want the owner to cut down and distribute the Peah equally, he may do so. So that would be a chiddush, but that's seemingly what the Mishnah is saying as well. Mishnah Beis. The Mishnah continues with the same halacha. B'dalus u'b'dekel einikin. In the case of the grapevine and the date, which is dangerous to climb up, so it's not so that we follow the one who wants all the poor people to compete freely for the Peah. Rather, even if 99 of the poor people who are present say that they don't want the owner to distribute it to them, rather they want to grab as much Peah as they can, and only one of them says that he wants the owner to distribute the Peah equally, to this one we listen, for he has spoken according to the law. The owner must follow the wishes of the lone poor person who wishes for him to distribute the Peah equally, because that lone poor person is insisting on following the established law for Peah from the grapevine and the date palm. Mishnah Gimel. As we learned in Mishnah Aleph, the basic halacha of Peah is that the poor people have it in open competition with one another. The Mishnah is going to talk about a poor person who tries to use a different method to gain advantage over others. And this the Gemara talks about of Mitzia, like this: Natal miktas Peah zark al hashar. A poor person took some of the Peah that he collected and he threw it over the rest of the Peah. But why? Because he was attempting to be kaina the rest of the Peah. Ein loy ba klum. He has no rights in it at all. Not to the Peah that he threw, and not to the Peah that's underneath that. If he threw himself over the standing Peah, or spread his talis, his clothing over it, in an attempt to thereby acquire it, we remove it from him and we give it to other poor people, and he's not kind of anything by throwing himself or his clothing over the Peah. And the same halacha applies to leket, and the same applies to shikha. There's a poor person who seeks to be kind of it by taking something and throwing it over the other things. By throwing things over it, it's treated the same way as he would be treated in the case of Peah. It didn't change. Which is interesting because Peah is guaranteed. Leket and Shikha are not guaranteed. It can't design that a person is going to harvest his whole field and he's not going to have anything that's left over for Leket and Shikha. Leket and Shikha, you don't know where they are either. So maybe he's going there to protect it. So they don't really rely, the Aniyim can't really rely on Leket and Shikha as much as they can rely on Peah. So maybe you'll say that, it's much more difficult for the Ani to come and get the Leket and Shikha, so maybe he could be more protective over it, so by throwing his things over it, he would have more of a chance of getting it. So it's like the Mishnah, it doesn't work. Mishnah Daled. Peah in Kaitzonesa b'magles. This Mishnah and the next Mishnah are going to talk about other takonas that the Chacham were mazakin, that in how the poor people, the Aniyim, would compete for Peah. Peah in Kaitzonesa b'magles. You can't cut it down with sickles in the case of grain. Ve'ein oikronesa b'kardumas. And you can't dig it up with a kardum, is usually typed as an axe, but maybe over here it means like a shovel or a spade. in the case of onions, Kadesh Layakuvish Esrayehu, so that the poor people don't, by mistake or inadvertently or unintentionally or even intentionally, to hit one another with the metal tools while competing for the payout, because it might hurt each other. So we have to be careful about that. Okay. Mishnah Hey. Shalish Avoyos Bayoim, Bashachar Bachatzos Bamincha. There are 3 appearances a day that the Balabayas, the owner of the field, should show up in his field so that the poor will be able to collect the pay at that time. Basically, he opens the doors to let them in. The poor people are not going to come into the field to take the payah unless the bailam of the field is there. So, why? Because otherwise there's a chashash that the poor people might steal. So we don't want to allow them into the field that they should have this chashash that they're going to steal. Therefore, the chachom are misaken what time is a good time for the poor people to come and collect the payah. B'shachar, u'b'chatzos b'mincha, in the morning, and at noon, and the late afternoon, which would mean mincha kitana time. Gamliel says, Lo Amru Ela Kadesh Leifchasu. Gamliel says that the Chacham were misaken these 3 times only kadei that the Bailam shouldn't make less appearances in the field. However, they may make additional collection times if they want. Rabbi Kiva Amru Ela Kadesh Leisifu. Rabbi Kiva says the opposite. Rabbi Kiva says the Chacham were misaken these 3 times a day, so that the farmers don't appear more than 3 times during the day, but they may show up even less than that. According to Gamliel, this takana of the Shalish Avoyos Bayoim were instituted as a minimum to make payah available to the people that are unfortunate, and it would be a convenient time for them. But additional times are permitted, because even though none of these, they wouldn't come at these additional, even though none of the 3 groups mentioned above will be able to collect at those additional times, and the amount of payah available to them at the regular times will be reduced. Afal Pikein, he's still allowed to change the times. But according to Rabbi Kiva, the main concern of the Chachamim being misaken these 3 Shalish Avoyos Bayoim was to prevent the Bailam from, if the Bailam is going to be like a scarecrow, people aren't going to come into the field to collect payah, they're going to be scared. And maybe people are going to take less than they should, and Rabbi Kiva wanted to stop that. The Mishnah now mentions a interesting practice that made the collection of payah even easier and more convenient for the aniyim. Instead of leaving payah for the entire field at the end, the people who lived in Beis Namer would gather the produce of their fields along a rope that they would extend from the beginning of each row kemat until the end of the row. And then when they reached the end of the rope, they would leave the rest of payah from each and every row, and it was a marked place, there was a marked area of where they should be able to collect their payah from. Okay. But the Yerushalmi does mention over here that while the way the farmers of Beis Namer left payah was praiseworthy, they happened to leave only 1/100th of their crop as payah rather than 1/60th minimum set aside by the Chachamim, as mentioned in Parak Aleph Mishnah Beis. And while the Chachamim praised them for the way they left the payah, the Chachamim also criticized them for the small amount that they left. They left the payah in a nice way, but they didn't leave enough. They should have been more generous. Okay, the Mishnah now discusses the halacha of a farmer in Eretz Yisrael who was megayer at some point in the harvest. A Ovid Avodah Zarah, a guy, gathered his field, and then he was megayer, and it was before the bundles of produce were moved to the threshing floor. So he's parted from these halachas of Matan Saniyim. Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv b'shikha she'ein hashikha ela b'shas imor. Rabbi Yehuda is mechayiv in shikha, that the ger is mechuyev to in shikha. Why? Because shikha is something that takes effect only at the time of the removal of the bundles from the field. So when he bekutzrechem, the pasuk says bekutzrechem as ksir artzachem is bekutzrechem when it belongs to the yid. But if it belongs to a guy, it's not mechuyev, right? Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv b'shikha because b'shas imor, when he's being me'amer, when he's gathering the bundles, that's later. So then he was already a ger and he's already chayiv in all the mitzvahs. But the Chachamim say that since there's shikha b'omer, be'ika shikha b'kama, so just like by kama, the Ovid Kachavim is going to be part of because he was a guy. So too the shichas Oimer is also going to be, the ger is also going to be parted from, and the halach is not like a Yehuda, the halach is going to be like the Tanakh. Mishnah Zayin. This Mishnah will discuss a similar case of produce that would be exempt from lechet, shich, and peah if it did not qualify as a kutzrechem at the time of the gathering. Hikdish kama pada kama. If one was makdish a kama, the crop while it was still standing, and then he was paid it while it was still standing, so it's still mechuyev in lechet, shich, and peah when he gathers it together. Oimrin a pada oimrin, he's chayiv. If he was makdish the bundles, and then he was paid while it was still bundles, he's still mechuyev in lechet, shich, and peah. Why is this? In this case as well, the produce was owned by an individual Jew at the time it was cut. The obligation of leket shich and peah could therefore still take effect. Mishnah Ches. Kayoytzebay. Hamakdish peiros abat shloi bo loinas hamaisus upadon chayavin. The Mishnah is going to discuss that a person took his produce, which is pater from a certain chiyuv, and it wasn't, if it was not subject to that obligation at the critical time. Similarly, kayoytzebay. If one was makdish his peiros before they were mechuyev and maisers, and then he was paid to them, still before they were mechuyev and maisers, chayavin, because when they're mechuyev, they were still, when they're mechuyev and maiser, it still belongs to him. Misha bola enes maisers upadan chayavin. If he was makdish them after they were already mechuyev and maiser, and then he was paid to them, they were also mechuyev and maiser because it belonged to him when they were still mechuyev and maiser. If, however, he was makdish them before they were finished the miruach, and the hektish finished did the miruach, his pater, and then if the person was paid to them after the hektish did miruach, so then it's going to be pater from meiser, because at the time of the chiyuv meiser, they belonged to hektish, and therefore it's pater from meiser. So even after they were parted, because b'shas l'chiyuv, they belonged to somebody who would pater them from meiser, so they remain pater from meiser. Mishnah Tes. Misha lokat asapeya. Somebody who's rich, he's not entitled to take peah. He collected peah from a field. V'omar harezel ish pleni ani, and he said, "I'm collecting this for a certain ani." So what's the halacha? Rabbi Lezer mezachalei. Rabbi Lezer says that he's eichet for the poor man. The rich man can acquire pay on behalf of the poor man, and the poor man can own it. The Chachamim say he has to give it to the first poor person that he sees, because he wasn't kind it for the person. So we mentioned earlier that payah is free for any poor person to take. Once a particular poor person makes a kinyan on it, he becomes the owner. Ordinarily, when a person wishes to acquire an object, he doesn't have to make a kinyan himself, because someone else can make the kinyan for him, which is called schir. But Lezer holds that a rich man, although not personally entitled to acquire payah, can be zeicha on behalf of a particular poor person. The Chachamim hold, on the other hand, that since the rich man is not entitled to payah, he cannot be zeicha on behalf of a poor person. Therefore, the payah that the rich man collected still belongs to the poor people to take, and he cannot withhold it from them. Rather, he has to give it to the ani hanimtza rishon. Even the Chachamim agree that a poor person who is mechuyev in payah can be zeicha to another ani, and the payah therefore becomes a property of the second poor person. Since the first poor person is able to take it, so he's able to be zeicha because he's able to be zeicha for himself. Migudi boy zachi lenafshei, zachi nami lechavrei. Because he's able to take it for himself, he is able to take it for somebody else. Masha enkein, the wealthy person, he can't take it for himself. So if he can't take it for himself, he can't take it for another person. This is a sugya in Bav Metzia that the Gemara goes through. Actually, Rebbe Lezer also agrees that zechiyah works only if the first one has this migu of, since he can take it for himself. The reason he says that the rich man can take the pay on behalf of the poor person is that the rich person can take it for himself also, and he can be mafker everything, because migu di boy mafker l'nichse. So on top of the migu di boy zachi l'nafshi zachi nami l'chavre, he also has the migu of di boy mafker nichse. He could also theoretically declare all his property ownerless and thereby become a poor person who is now mechuyev in payah. So Rebbe Lezer says that we could say two migus, and then the rich man could be mafker as nechasam, and then migu di boy zachi l'nafshi zachi nami l'chavre. The Chachamim say the chad migu amrinon, trei migu lo amrinon. But Me'ani la'ani divrei hakol zachalai. As we explained before, that for one poor person to be mezaka, to give it to another ani, divrei hakol, everyone agrees that he can be zaycheta for the other ani. Haleket v'ashicha v'apeya sh'le'eved kechav v'chayv v'maishas. The Mishnah goes on to discuss another halacha of haleket shicha and peya of a goy is mechuyev v'maiser. Since the farmer is not obligated to leave the gifts from the poor person in his field, he is. A leket shich of a peah shel eved kechav and chayv v'maiser. The leket shich and peah of a goy are mechuyev v'maiser. Elam ken hifker, unless he declared that the leket shich and peah are hefker to rich people and to poor people. In that case, the hefker produce is exempt from maises, but otherwise, it's free for all to be able to take. Which is interesting, because be'etzem, you would say, well, a goy, why would a goy be mechuyev? The goy's not mechuyev, but the goy's field is mechuyev, because he's not mechuyev in leket shich and peah, because that only belongs to kutz rechem, it's only for a yid. But the land is mechuyev in maiser. So the leket shich and a peah of a goy are chayv and maiser, unless he was mafkir it. Okay, Mishnah Yud. The previous Mishnah completes the discussion of peah. Now the Tana is going to teach us about leket. The Torah says, "V'leket ketircha le'selaket la'ani v'lager tazevaysom." The leket of your harvesting you shall not gather. For the poor person and the convert shall you leave them. Ezehu leket. So what's considered leket that you have to leave for the poor? So hanoisher b'shas haktzira. Any stalk that falls to the ground at the time of the reaping, at the time of the gathering, as the person cuts down the stalks, some stalks fell to the ground, these must be left for the poor people to take. If he was cut a handful of grain, or if he plucked a fistful of some of the other produce, but instead of the person dropping the stalks in the normal course of cutting or plucking, he got a splinter. He was struck by a thorn, and something fell from his hand to the ground. Hareyu shel balabayas belongs to the owner and does not have a loch of leket, because it's only if it drops out of the hand through the normal course of harvesting, but not when something happens to him. If the stalks fall from within the hand or from within the sickle, that's what goes to the poor people. But if they fall from behind the hand or from behind the sickle, meaning outside of the hand, they belong to the owner. Since the stalk that fell was both behind the hand and behind the sickle, it's not considered leket. Rosh hayad v'rosh hamagol. If the stalk had been held with the tip of the hand or cut with the tip of the sickle, so then Rabbi Shmuel Omer la'aniyim, Rabbi Kiva Omer la'balabais. So Rabbi Shmuel says it's leket and belongs to the aniyim, and the tip, the rosh hayad, is still considered as within, is toich hayad, and that's going to be mechuyev. And it's going to go to the aniyim. Rabbi Kiva Omer la'balabais, because he says it's not leket and it belongs to the owner, and therefore the rosh is going to be the same as the achere hayad and the achere hamagol, which is going to belong to the balabayas, which is going to be potter from leket and shikha, really only leket in this case. Mishnah Yud Aleph. If ant holes that are in the field with the standing stalks, that is, a field whose harvest has not yet started, and he has kernels of grain in them, they belong to the owner. Since the field's harvest had not yet begun, there cannot be any grains that belong to the poor. Therefore, the grain belongs to the owner. But if the ant holes are in a field that is behind those that are cutting it, which is a field who they already started harvesting, even if the part of these ant holes has not yet been cut down, the top grains in those holes belong to the poor, but the bottom grains belong to the owner. What are these cherin and molim? The top grain, which is white, belongs to the poor, since they were probably taken by the ants after the harvest started, and thus might very well be from the leket that found the harvested part of the field. But the bottom ones, which would be green, which were definitely taken from the unripened standing crop, therefore belong to the owner. So Remeir Omer Hakol Aniyim Shesafik Leket Leket. Remeir says that all the grains in these holes belong to the poor. The Cheri Hanamalim are in the holes underground from the ants. So Remeir Omer Hakol Aniyim, all the grains in these holes belong to the poor, because halacha is that any Safik Leket is considered like it, even though you would have to say normally Amaitzi Mechaber Lavaraya, but because the pasuk says La'oni V'Lager Tazoiv, so then we understand that to mean that even what's usually yours, we don't say Amaitzi Mechaber Lavaraya, and therefore Hanach Lifnei Mishalach, you have to leave any suffix for them as well. The Tanakama also accepts the rule that suffix leket, which is why he rules that the white grains go to the poor people also. He holds, however, that the possibility that the green grains come from the harvested crop is too remote to consider. He therefore assumes that they definitely came from the standing crop. Ad Kan Perek Dalid of Maseches Peah.